Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. Have you ever thought that you needed more business knowledge? Are you considering an MBA so that you can move into the administrative or corporate world? I've thought about it for years. My guest today is Dr. Joseph Kim, MD, MBA. He served as the faculty for the American Association of Physician Leadership, formerly known as the American College of Physician Executives. He's also written articles for a Physician Leadership Journal, and he's spoken to physician groups about the value of the MBA for healthcare professionals. Listen to this episode before you spend thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars before you get another degree. All right, welcome to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. My guest today is Dr. Joseph Kim. We're going to start with your educational background. You have an engineering degree from MIT, an MD from the University of Arkansas, a master's in public health from UMass, and an MBA from St. Joseph. A lot of education, Dr. Kim.
Yeah, I guess they call it lifelong learning. And for me, it just seems like it's an ongoing journey.
That's right.
It's been a lot of fun, though.
Good. And currently, you are the president of Synthesis LLC and on the medical board for a medical advisory board for Doximity. And you also consult about social media for healthcare professionals. And you're on a website, nonclinicaljobs.com, for physicians who are looking for opportunities away from clinical practice.
Yeah, I'd say that, in addition to keeping sort of the focus on my day job of running a CME company, I've been sort of tinkering on a variety of different ventures and projects, and non-clinical jobs started back probably like around 2007, originally as a blog, as sort of a resource. It's since grown into an online membership directory of over 4,000 physicians who signed up, as well as we've had job boards and different ways of promoting jobs as well. But it's primarily, I would say, a resource for medical students, residents, and practicing docs who really want to see what else they could do if they were to leave the world of traditional clinical medicine.
Tell me a little bit about the medical education company, Synthesis.
Sure. So Synthesis is a continuing medical education company, and I like to tell people that in many ways it's sort of like a publishing company. We work with a variety of different providers of continuing education, whether those are private companies or academic centers or medical schools and professional societies. And the projects that we may implement may include continuing medical education, CME, as well as nursing and pharmacy education as well. And we primarily get industry grants that support the educational initiatives that we provide. So we may get several different grants, for instance, on a particular topic, say it's on diabetes, and maybe 3 or 4 different pharmaceutical companies have supported the project. Then we essentially will then pull together the content, work with the faculty, and implement that project, whether it's an online project, whether it's a live educational initiative. So a variety of different things, but it allows us, I would say, to stay on the cutting edge of what's happening in medical devices as well as pharmaceuticals, and know what's both in the pipeline as well as what's emerging, and giving education not only around the science of what's new, but also around quality improvement, process improvement, practice improvement. So things that they can really apply in their daily practice to not only improve patient care, but also enhance workflow efficiencies.
And how long have you run this company?
So Synthesis is still new. I started it back in when I left my old job in February of 2016. And prior to that, I was with a similar type of medical education company called MCM Education, a small privately held company. I'd been there for almost 10 years and decided it was time to venture off on my own and start sort of carving my own path and exploring some other things that I could be doing. So it's been quite a ride, I would say, just in the last year that I've been on my own and building this company up, but also at the same time working on some other projects.
Our topic today is going to be about the MBA for healthcare professionals. There's a lot of talk amongst physicians about the value of getting an MBA. A lot of doctors, a little bit disillusioned with the direction of healthcare. They think that maybe getting an MBA will help their ability to affect change in a broader sense. Tell me what you think, what is the utility of getting the MBA? MBA, and who should get it may not benefit from it?
Sure. So, first I'd like to just say that obviously I only represent an opinion of one, an N of one.
Sure.
However, I've spoken to a lot of both students, residents, and practicing physicians who've taken this journey as well as explored their options. I like to sort of segment it into three categories. The first category are the MD, MBA students, those who are in school and perhaps their school offers a dual degree program. Some of them, I think, are either entrepreneurial minded or business minded. Perhaps they see an opportunity and they're not really sure how they're going to use that MBA. Or some of them know that they just want to go right into the business world and they're going to skip, residency altogether. So that first group, I think, is a really interesting one because more and more medical schools now offer these dual degree programs. And I think it allows the students to get exposed to a lot of interesting things around healthcare and learn more about the processes of healthcare and health policy. But my sort of warning to that group is that if they don't have real world working experience, if they've never actually worked before, if they've just always been in school from the time that they graduated high school, right into college, right into medical school, the value of that MBA, I think, is going to be not nearly the same as someone who actually understands sort of the inner workings of a business, whether that's a hospital, whether that's a corporation. But regardless, I'm not saying that to dissuade them from pursuing an MBA. I've just spoken to students who have asked the question, should I do it while I'm in med school or should I get the MBA later? And I would say in general, those who've taken the later route have found greater value in what they actually acquired. So that's the first group. The second group, I would say, are the physicians who are working in healthcare settings, primarily in hospitals or large groups, and they feel like they need more formal training. They also want that leadership experience and that added, degree on their resume. But they also feel that having that MBA will allow them to speak at a different level and caliber with administrators within their own organizations. And in some regards, they might be speaking to executive recruiters and headhunters who are telling them that it's almost expected that they should have an MBA. I think for that category of physicians, they are planning on still staying in the healthcare delivery setting, but perhaps rising into a position in administration, or maybe they are just exploring other things that they can do. Perhaps they're foreseeing that they don't want to continue this sort of full-time practice role and they want to sort of blend that with some clinical responsibilities and some administrative responsibilities, or maybe they just really have a passion for health policy and sort of not only national policies but also policies at the local level. So I find that for that group, there are not only the traditional MBA routes, but also very physician-centric MBAs, programs even that their own hospital or health system might endorse or support. They may send them with cohorts so that they can learn with other physicians in their group, as well as other administrators and nursing staff and people who really form that healthcare team. And many of them join professional societies like the American Association for Physician Leadership, where they may get either an MBA or a master's in medical management, an MMM or triple M as they're called, or they may join the American College of Healthcare Executives, ACHE, where they join, and meet with other administrators. And I think for them, the MBA helps to round out their knowledge of things like finance and accounting, but also helps them have that added credibility that they're either expected to have or that they just, feel a little bit more confident and comfortable with what they're doing in that sort of delivery setting. And then the third group is sort of the group that I call the physicians who see that they don't want to practice medicine anymore. And perhaps they want to completely leave that clinical delivery type of setting. So these might be entrepreneurs who want to start their own business, people who perhaps want to work in the pharmaceutical or biotech industry or go into health IT or, just do something completely different, still related to healthcare, but not in that delivery setting. And I think for many of them, they feel like having an MBA will allow them to just really quickly jump into the business world. And I think there's a warning there that I've met many physicians who either have an MBA or who pursued an MBA sort of with that intent. And then all of a sudden they're like, this degree really hasn't helped me or it's not helping me anymore. And I think the warning is that, in addition to the formal education and the training that you receive when you get the MBA, there's also real value in the networking component when you actually interact with your other colleagues and students, whether that's in a live setting, whether it's an online cohort, whatever that sort of learning environment might be. And if you're not leveraging that networking capability credibility and the alumni network that your school provides, then particularly in the business world, I don't think it's going to open up the kinds of doors of opportunity that you may have expected it to. So for those who are planning that total career transition, almost knee-jerk reaction is, I need to get an MBA, then from there I can enter the business world. And I think they need to sort of pause and say, well, there are a lot of other ways to enter the business world. And the value of that MBA, particularly when you think about the time, the money, the energy that goes into that degree, may or may not be worth it. So I would sort of caution that third group to really make sure you're planning ahead and thinking through what that real value is going to be, and then sort of make your decisions accordingly.
Okay, so you packed a lot of information there, really important stuff. Let's start with the last group that you mentioned, the physicians who are kind of looking outside of clinical medicine and looking to join pharmaceuticals or medical device companies. And what you mentioned, and I think this is a very key thing, is the networking benefit. Most physicians who pursue this route don't really step away from medicine full-time, but are rather enroll in their online programs, which they attend part-time, maybe weekend programs at their local university, or even some of these national executive programs where they may fly out once or twice a month for the MBA program. And some of these are reasonably cost-effective, not so, ranging from $25,000 to $30,000 to, I just saw before we started talking, I was looking up, Northwestern is a $200,000 executive MBA. And I think the part that you mentioned is critical. I mean, you talked about the networking benefit. Do you think that physicians in these executive programs would receive the same level of networking benefits that someone in a full-time program?
Right. So you're asking that question about sort of that return on investment. If someone were to sit down and calculate, how much am I going to spend, both in terms of what I'm shelling out of my pocket, pay for this degree, as well as in some cases, potentially even lost revenue from the time that they take, so you have to sort of calculate all of that.
Exactly.
I find that out of the groups that I've talked to, there's sort of two schools of thought as it relates to the networking benefits and sort of the power of that alumni network. And I think the first school of thought is that there are certain people out there who really see the value of those top tier programs, whether those are, Ivy League schools or just really top nationally recognized and even globally recognized brands. Many of them are obviously going to require a significant financial investment. And undoubtedly, there's tremendous value in having a top rated degree on your resume.
Right.
But I think, many physicians also may already have that either from medical school or from their undergraduate. So,
right.
If you already have, say, for instance, an Ivy League undergrad and then you went to a top tier med school, then the question becomes, all right, well, where do you now want to get your business degree from? And there's real power, I think, in terms of who you're going to be able to connect with if you're at one of these top tier schools. Having said that, when you also look at the world of business and you look at whether it's the top, Fortune 50 companies or whatever sort of category you want to look at, and you look at, for instance, who are the CEOs, who are the leading executives of many of these companies, whether they're, large global companies that everyone would recognize, or even some of the mid-sized companies, you're going to see a very wide, diverse mix of people who are at the top, including, as we all know, there are people who've dropped out of college and never even got a degree and
right.
sort of, succeeded in this world, as well as those who went to what many of us might consider state schools or just sort of average universities, very solid schools and solid degrees where they were able to rise to the top. So I think we have to sort of take that step back and ask, okay, it's great to get a top tier education. You're going to be networking with a very different caliber of students. Perhaps the question shouldn't be where are you going to get your degree, but who will be your classmates? If you're in a cohort where everyone else in your class are either doctors or healthcare administrators, then you're almost committing yourself to that sort of degree pathway. Whereas if you're thinking I might want to venture into the biotech or pharmaceutical world, or I may want to go into health IT, or maybe even start my own business, then, who would you want in your classroom? And I think there's value in being surrounded by a classroom of people who work in healthcare, whether it's in the healthcare industry or something related to healthcare and the life sciences. And there's also value in being in a classroom where you have people from multiple different industries, whether that's the food industry or the telecommunications industry, because the kinds of things you learn, the perspectives are going to be very, very different. So there's certainly not a one size fits all. I think there are a lot of different pros and cons to the ways that we can approach this. For those who are thinking about that sort of top tier degree and making a huge financial investment of their own to support their own education to get that degree, I think depending on how much debt they may already have from school loans and everything else, they have to really weigh that into consideration. Whereas many of these other executives, when they pursue an MBA, they're getting support from their own organizations, that their companies might be funding those degrees, or at least, subsidizing a considerable cost. Now, on the topic of subsidies, in terms of what corporations will provide, whether it's full reimbursement or partial reimbursement, those policies can change. During my time in business school, a lot of my classmates had their same companies that they were with, change those reimbursement policies from year to year to year. So always keep that in mind.
True. And almost no physicians, unless they're already part of a university program that I'm aware of, get reimbursed to a significant degree for these programs. So I agree. You really do have to assess the value. And it's not just the cost of attendance, as you said, but loss of clinical revenue from time away from practice, and also just the benefit and cost of the time that you're away from your family, plus the amount of time you're going to be working for the classwork and the case presentations and those things during your MBA coursework. So definitely need to look at those all those issues. Let me ask you, as far as you mentioned physician recruiters talking to physicians about needing the MBA, there are other types that you had mentioned of courses, such as the American College of, I think you said American College of Health Executives. They have some of their own programs that may not give you coursework, but are not necessarily MBA degrees. What are your thoughts on using that and to use that to advance within the administrative hospital health?
Sure. So there are definitely some national organizations that will allow physicians to attend their seminars and their conferences and use some of those credits where they actually get CME, a continuing medical education, and they can actually use some of those credits towards a formal degree from an academic center. So for instance, the the Association for Physician Leadership, which used to be called the American College of Physician Executives, has signed agreements with a number of national schools, for instance, UMass Amherst being one for the MBA and several others for the MMM degree, where, they do sort of their prerequisite work through the association. The university then recognizes those credits and applies them towards the degree. And then if the student pursues the degree, then the university then confers that degree to the student. So I think there's a lot of value in that. I think the Triple M degree, the MMM or Masters of Medical Management, is not as well recognized outside of the healthcare delivery systems. So when someone says I have an MD/MMM, a lot of people may not understand what that Triple M represents, whereas, the MBA is pretty universally recognized.
Right.
And I think that there are other degrees as well, like for instance, the Masters of Healthcare Administration, MHA, which is really one of the most popular degrees, I would say, among healthcare administrators. And when you're talking about the other group, the American College of Healthcare Executives, many of the student groups and alumni networks, if you will, are from those MHA programs. You don't see as many MD/MHAs out there, but I would say that if a physician is really interested in pursuing that healthcare administration sort of career within a health delivery system or a hospital, that might be something that would be more worthwhile, just because then they're going to have a common alumni network, and they can also get more plugged in with other people who don't necessarily have the MD degree, but they may have either a clinical degree, some other clinical degree, or that administrative type of degree.
As far as the other cohort of physicians, dentists, who really are just looking to improve their own practice, whether it's a solo practice, a group practice, their own private organization, what are your thoughts on getting an MBA for them versus other business education?
Yeah, so I think for that group, and there's still a pretty strong group of very independent physicians out there, for them, I would say if they're planning on retiring with that model of independence or, partnership, they don't really need to make the investment to get a formal degree. And that's just the practical side of me speaking. I think there's so much learning that they can do on their own. They can take coursework from, online websites like Coursera or edX, as well as just do Google searches and listen to webinars, do a lot of reading on their own, because, the fundamentals, I would say, of things like accounting and finance, most people can learn that on their own. They don't need someone to teach that to them in that formal setting. And if they're planning on that either partnership or solo practitioner route, and they want to retire that way, then having that added degree isn't going to boost their income in any way. It's not like their employer is going to pay them more. So, my suggestion for them is, just take that sort of self-motivated, learn on your own at your own pace. There are plenty of materials out there where people can, where you can actually listen to lectures. And even though they're busy, I try to encourage people, listen to lectures while you're exercising, or just listen to different podcasts or recordings. I think there's so much informal education learning that can happen. And for them, it's very contextualized. They need to think about how they're going to improve their own efficiencies. They know what the issues are. And the only other point I would make for them is because they're in a very rapidly evolving environment of healthcare delivery today, with things like healthcare reform and all these other topics floating around, just getting more in tune with national health policy issues, I think is really going to be important for them. And once again, they don't need a formal degree, but just understanding health policy, understanding their role in things such as advocacy, and perhaps even sitting in some of the committees and work groups that their national organizations may offer will allow them to not only get immersed into that, but also really be able to contribute to the profession.
And I agree. I've myself have taken a few of the Coursera courses that Wharton offers, and they're tremendous resources just for basic knowledge. So I completely agree with your line of thinking there. One of the things that I think physicians and other healthcare professionals think about when they get the MBA as well, okay, I've put this investment in, I've paid X amount of dollars, but I really want to do it, or I'm in the process of doing it. What kind of income differences can these healthcare professionals with the MBA hope to achieve after they get the degree? A physician with an MBA who works as an executive in a hospital system versus a clinician, what kind of differences should they think about?
Yeah, I think the salary / income question is much more complex, and the reason I say that is, I've met, cardiothoracic surgeons and people like that who had an active clinical practice making X dollars a year.
Right.
And suddenly they may become medical director of their hospital or, vice president of medical affairs, and their salary gets slashed essentially, right? Versus someone who, say, is an average primary care physician who suddenly moves up the rank and achieves that medical directorship, and suddenly their salary goes up. So I think it can go up or down, and depending on where you are in your career, people may be okay with it going down. A surgeon who makes X dollars a year may say, all right, I'm now in a part of my career where I want to sort of step back and not deal with sort of the medical pressures of either, operating on a patient or, the various liabilities that come with clinical care. I'm okay just having this sort of advisor role or this administrative role. And if my salary is somewhere between $250,000 to $350,000 a year, I'm okay with that because maybe I was making a lot more before then. So I think it really varies. There are national statistics that these search firms and other national organizations will publish around, for instance, what a chief medical officer might make versus a medical director versus a VPMA, a vice president of medical affairs. And I think these salaries really need to be taken with a grain of salt because on one hand, some of these directorships might be part-time. And they have to assign that rate based on fair market value in their own regions, and they have to be able to justify that rate. So they can't give someone a part-time directorship role and pay them some astronomical salary because someone might then, scrutinize that. And that information obviously is not just between the employer and the doctor. There are a lot of other administrators and financial officers and people like that they have to sort of report to. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that there is sort of this fair market value parameter that restricts and limits what types of incomes are available. And given that some of these directorships are part-time, the expectation is that the doc is going to continue to work in a clinical capacity and also have maybe this part-time responsibility as well. So I think there are many different models out there. For many of these roles, you don't need to have that additional degree. But if your plan is to move outside of your own system and go somewhere else, and if you're going through recruiters, then they're going to want you to have that because it's it's going to be easier for them to sell you as a candidate. Whereas if you're simply advancing or transitioning within your own institution, then people already know you. They already know what your skill sets are and what value you deliver. And, frankly, one of the most important things that the administrators need and want from a physician executive is that level of being able to get the buy-in with the other doctors, to engage them, to get them to sort of align with the administration's priorities. And it's a lot harder for a stranger to do that, even if the stranger has an MD, versus if it's one of their colleagues and peers. And so there's that sort of informal social component to this role that is critical when it comes to getting other doctors aligned and to get them to buy into what the hospital or the administration is trying to do. And it's just part of human nature and sort of the culture of the organization. So I think these are all components that need to be factored in. And depending on what your starting or your current base salary might be, the expectation is that your salary may go up or down depending on, once again, what kind of role you move yourself into.
I think one of the other things that a lot of physicians who may be looking to move into the administrative side of medicine, if they're looking to do it full time, you also have to be ready to potentially move around more frequently than you would if you were staying in your clinical practice. Because in speaking with some healthcare hospital CEOs, they've had jobs at multiple different health systems, even in multiple states. So if you want to continue to progress amongst that train and you're relatively early in your career, you may have to consider that well, as opposed to being in clinical practice where you may be able to stay at your current job for an extended period of time.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think that today, probably when we think about where we're situated across the country, whether we're in a small town, whether we're in a large city, the health systems, the hospitals that surround us in our neighborhood may not be the same names in 3, 5, or 10 years.
Right.
And so as we see more either mergers and consolidations, acquisitions, partnerships, there's so many changes happening even just within the healthcare delivery system. And so to that point, as you advance into different roles, if there are mergers or acquisitions and changes at those levels, then suddenly you may be out of a job and you may have to move somewhere else. Or the corporate sort of headquarters might see that, wow, this person is such a strong, powerful asset. We really need this person's influence somewhere else, and they may really strongly encourage you to move elsewhere. So that's certainly true and becoming more true in hospital and healthcare delivery systems. I would say in the traditional business world of, pharma, biotech, and health plans and so forth, there's definitely a lot more movement as well. And that's just more traditional, what I would call sort of corporate expectations. Not only is there a lot more travel for your day-to-day work, but also travel involved or movement involved with either career advancement or in some cases simply just needing to transition to a new role because perhaps your position was eliminated, or maybe there were some other transitions even within the corporation that occurred.
Let me ask you this now. We talked about the other industries that healthcare professionals may look to if they want to maybe transition out of clinical practice, such as pharma, device manufacturers. You also have these big consulting firms like McKinsey. What are your experiences with other MBAs, physician MBAs, or who have maybe transitioned into these type of roles? What kind of change have they had in terms of their lives? You mentioned the travel, but just in general, like what are some of the things that we should be looking for? I guess what I'm really trying to say is everyone thinks the grass is always greener on the other side, and so some of the things in these other industries that may not come to the heads of physicians who are looking to maybe transition into these things.
Sure. So I would sort of lump this into a few categories. The first category are those who are early in their training and perhaps they went into medical school knowing that they just want to be partner at a major consulting firm, for instance. And so they don't even do residency and they go right into consulting. They travel a lot and they sort of work up their ranks. Or we see in other areas like the Bay Area in particular, where these very entrepreneurial minded folks may fall into a digital health startup or create their own company. Once again, either drop out of residency or forego residency altogether and have a very successful career. So I think there's sort of that young entrepreneurial mindset where they know what they want. They're very driven and motivated. They're willing to make certain sacrifices as it relates to, lifestyle and travel and what have you. But they also know exactly how they're going to get there. And if they hit bumps along the way, then I'm sure they will be able to pivot or do whatever they need to because they have that resilience as well as that, that motivation. So I think that first group is a very kind of unique group, but I think we're going to see more of them them, particularly as the younger generation of people are going through school, getting exposed to all sorts of not only technology, but resources in the digital world, and seeing the opportunities that they can start piecing together things very quickly and really making a difference. I think the second group are what I would call the traditional sort of physicians who are either mid-career or perhaps even late career, and they realize that it's time for a change. Maybe they're burned out of medicine. They think the grass is greener on the other side. They don't really know because they've not worked on that other side before, but they take that plunge. And with that group, I find that there are some who continue with clinical medicine. They want to keep that sort of backup plan just in case the business world doesn't work for them. So maybe they work a shift a month, or maybe they continue to see patients at some odd intervals, and they're able to sort of juggle and balance those two together until they know for sure that they want to make that investment into the business world. And granted, in many cases, they have to do a lot more travel, but they don't have to take call at nights or on the weekends. But of course, they may have to answer emails or urgent calls at nights and the weekends if they're working for a company that's sort of a global company and they have clients all over the world. So I think there's always sort of that work-life trade-off depending on the size of the organization as well as the industry that they're working in. For those who are older in their, sort of more advanced in their career, perhaps they're older physicians, they're getting ready to retire, they're thinking about that, what I would call their encore career, sort of what's next. I think for them, it's a very different kind of a lens. Many of them I have found are able to do some part-time, medical directorships for whether it's a digital health startup or for some other company, not only because of the years of experience that they've accumulated, but also because of all the people that they now know and the kind of influence that they can make. So for them, they may have a very different type of a role. There's a different category there too, where particularly in the life sciences and the biotech pharma world, we've seen so many of these companies merging and getting acquired, and many mid-tier both medical directors and VPs who suddenly lost their jobs and were unable to find equivalent jobs. So then they started doing their own consulting or they built their own companies. So I think the landscape is really shifting in the business world in regards to the types of opportunities as well as the expectations from corporations. And on top of that, sort of adding another layer of complexity is what I would call the gig economy, the Ubers of the world that have really disrupted what we might consider to be normal employment. And if we believe that over the next, 5 to 10 years and 10 plus years, that more of this sort of independent workers, that they're going to be flooding the workplace, and that people aren't necessarily going to want full-time employment with all the traditional benefits, but rather they're going to want to sort of carve out different roles and ways that they can work, and maybe even flexible working arrangements. That could really cause some additional disruptions once we reach a tipping point. And I think for those doctors, it may offer opportunities for them now wear several different hats. They may do a few shifts a month, whether it's at a hospital or an ER, maybe locum tenens. And then on top of that, they may have another job that maybe requires them to do some, 20, 30 hours a week. And then they may have a third category altogether where they're either volunteering or doing something else. So I almost see that might become the norm in some ways, particularly for certain groups of people and depending on where they're located in the country.
A lot of things to think about for those physicians who are thinking about the MBA program. And it seems to be a common thought amongst my colleagues and especially mid-career physicians. But I thank you, Dr. Kim, for the information. I think we can take away a lot of good points from our discussion. And where can our listeners find out more about you and your company?
Sure. So I like to, particularly for this topic, I like to point people to the website nonclinicaljobs.com. And I think from there, if they want to get a hold of me, my contact information is available. And for others who might have an interest in continuing medical education or sort of the medical education landscape, my website, qsynthesis.com, is where you can learn more about that company. But in general, I like to point everyone to LinkedIn, which is the professional networking site, as well as sites like Doximity and others, because that's where, from my perspective, the value of being able to just meet people, connect with people, share experiences, and then also facilitate introductions is one of the most important things that we can do to help one another. So I would encourage people to find me on LinkedIn and to connect with me there.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for appearing on the show.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thank Dr. Joseph Kim for being our guest today. I think it's an important discussion about MBAs and whether physicians actually need the degree I do think it's important that we have the business knowledge so we can speak the language with administrators, insurance companies, and all the other entities involved in healthcare. But I'm not sure that getting an expensive MBA is necessarily worth it. Many executives in the hospitals that most of you work at didn't receive prestigious MBAs and didn't spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. They just worked their way up and perhaps got a part-time degree at a local university. As Dr. Kim mentioned, I do think the networking thing is one thing that the more expensive, prestigious national universities may offer, but I don't think it's necessarily worth the cost difference between a $50,000 program and a $200,000 program, particularly for mid-career healthcare professionals. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. You can tweet me at Dr. Money Matters, or you can comment on our Facebook page at Dr. Money Matters, all spelled out, or you can send an email to comments@drmoneymatters.com. I want to thank Dr. Kim for being our guest again, and you can find out more about him at www.drjosephkim.com or his other websites, nonclinicaljobs.com, and his most recent company, Q Synthesis, which you can Google or you can look. I have a link on our show notes. Once again, any positive reviews on iTunes or Apple Podcast, Google Play would be much appreciated. Thanks again, and we'll be back soon with another episode.